Episode 25 already?
25th episode.
Yeah.
We've done 25 of these.
25. I know how to count all the way to 55.
55. Man, that's throwing it. That's throwing it back to the, what was it? What was that Flash
I
site?
don't even remember now.
I want to say Newgrounds. Is that a Newgrounds?
Yeah. All right. I'll tell you what it was. And I will tell you how to do it.
Man, that's going back in time.
It is. I'm sorry. It's going way back in time. Gotta get back in time.
And then we get copyright stricken.
For that?
Yeah, that little blurb right there is enough to demonetize.
We get copyright stricken for that? Ugh. I believe it was Jonas Salk who once said, they asked him, why didn't you patent your polio vaccine? And his answer was, well, would you patent the sun? Some food for thought.
Like, it's one of those rent-a-star programs. I guarantee somebody already owns it.
Mm-hmm.
But.
Or like Andy Warhol said, in the future, all of us will be famous for 15 minutes. I don't remember exactly, but for 8 to 15 minutes, I think, is the quote.
Yeah.
So how was your Halloween?
It's okay.
Yeah?
Nothing super great or exciting. I watched Sleepy Hollow.
Ooh, okay.
Which I hadn't watched that in a while, so that was a fun little redive. But
no, that's a good one. I dressed up as the Riddler.
You did do the Riddler thing?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Although kids kept asking me for riddles. You're going to start spreading rumors about me?
As far as I've come to learn, every rumor about you is true.
Like what? Like what rumor? Give me one.
That you're the Riddler.
No, kids kept coming up to me and asking if I had riddles, and I was like, I had to stop myself because most of the riddles, I'm like,
you should have pre-made cards. That'd have been perfect. You could have just handed them out.
Yeah, but I didn't plan it that far out in advance.
See you next time, baby.
We'll see next year. I'm trying to go big, and I might have bitten off more than I could chew. But I want to build my costume next year, and I want to do from.
God, that's gonna be great. I will make sure that stays a surprise. I won't include that.
We'll see if it can happen.
If that happens, though,
I mean, obviously it can happen.
I get dibs on it.
Okay. It's just a matter of if I can.
That's slick. I'm very interested to see you take that one.
We'll see if I can figure out. There just aren't many. I thought there'd be more like templates out there.
Yeah.
Because all I got to do is get like foam and start to build it piece by piece. But I thought there'd be like a template. And I'm like, oh, shoot. Mm-hmm. There's not. Or at least not a good one that I've found yet.
I went down a rabbit hole of like looking into like prop builders, like third-party prop builders a few years ago. And there might be something. There might be something out there.
There might be something out there?
Yeah, just might take some digging. But
speaking of rabbit holes and digging, I'll segue here a little bit into our main topic of discussion this week.
And
which is
when you first brought this one up to me, I did not know more than like the smallest bit about this. Okay.
No, I still do not know enough about it.
Yeah.
I did a little bit more digging for this episode with it. I've only ever heard it thrown around a few times, but the term is ludonarrative dissonance. Say that 5 times fast. 3 times fast. 5 times fast.
Ludonarrative dissonance. That's not fast.
Yeah, no, so it's definitely, it sounds almost like a medical term.
Or something that's not related to video games.
Yeah, you've been diagnosed with ludonarrative dissonance.
Oh, God. Doc, is it terminal?
You have the inability to perceive a beginning and an end.
How long do I have?
Well, actually, you're going to live forever. That's what this is.
Oh, no.
No, it's definitely, it's a strange term, but I kind of like it. And so simply put, I when I did more digging, we'll go into more about like where the term supposedly originated. Yeah. I don't know if there's a clear, this is definitely where it came from, or there's still debate on that, but this is the one I found. But essentially it is, simply put, it is another way of almost saying when you have a disconnect in the elements of the story.
Or the elements of the storytelling, right?
Yeah, and specifically we are referring to video games. This comes out of video games specifically, but I think it can be applied to other things, but it's particularly, it's progenitoration.
Yeah.
Is that a word?
What I found interesting when I kind of dove into this, because you brought this up a while back, I dove in and did a little research on my own, and I found that there was like some debate on this a while back as to whether this applies to, say, cinema or other forms. And what I found interesting was that out of that online debate formed a term called cinema narrative dissonance.
Cinema narrative dissonance.
Which is basically just the same thing for movies.
Okay. So it does. All right.
But I'm like, really, they are kind of, it's still just, I think the term can apply to anything.
Well, yeah. And so for me, at least how I've learned and come to define it, is specifically when you're talking to a video game, we are talking about how the narrative elements, if there is a story to it, are counterintuitive or contradictory to the gameplay. There's that lack of cohesion between the two.
Yeah.
And essentially, it's just I take it as this. It's just that, like, when you're making a piece of art, usually most of the time you want to make sure that everything's there for a purpose. That every part you put in not only has a relationship to every part in it, but then together they have a relationship with the entire story, image, whatever of itself. So the relationships of the parts of a project to the whole. And the dissonance is when those two things don't necessarily work together or don't work as well as they could.
And I guess that, like, the more you've flesh this out into, say, more multifaceted forms of art, say your obvious cardinal view video game, which is the most complex, or filmmaking, you have more gears turning, and the more potential it has for, say, 2 or 3 people involved to be potentially telling a different story than another 2 or 3 people involved.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, it's an interesting term, ludonarrative dissonance, and it supposedly was coined in 2007 by Clint Hawking. Is the guy's name? I don't know too much about him, but this was, I guess, just a term he came up with out of the blue. Maybe this is the so-called origin story of the term.
So coined by Stephen Hawking.
Hawking, Hocking, this guy. Anyway, but yeah, and this was essentially his reaction to the penultimate twist in the first BioShock game. Now, have you ever played BioShock?
I have, and I love that game, but I know exactly what they're referencing.
You do?
Yeah.
All right, take that away for, because I only played it for the first time not too long ago.
Yeah, it's been a long time, so it's probably fresher in your mind, honestly, than in mine. But yeah, there were elements of that story that definitely fall into line there.
Yeah. So essentially, in the game, you are this character who goes down into Rapture, this underwater, what's supposed to be a utopia, but ends up being a nightmare, a horrible place to be, and you can gain your powers by taking them from, what are they called? The little sisters?
Little sisters,
they're like these little girls.
You're supposed to harvest or rescue, as it's referred to as.
Yeah. You can choose to either harvest or rescue them. And they're surrounded by the iconic character, I think, of the series, at least in the beginning, the almost like underwater, like mech warrior look, the diver suit guys. Yeah. They're called the Big Daddies, who act as like their bodyguards, and you got to take them down in order to gain more power or level up, essentially. So for Hawking, I guess he found this was his definition of ludonarrative dissonance, and I think I'm getting it right. I'm going to just read it here. It occurs when ludic, and referring to like gameplay, and narrative themes of a text are inconsistent. As in BioShock, this is when the player is allowed to engage with the work's themes through actions in a way that contradict the themes presented in the narrative, spoiling those ludic experiences. Now, the concept of this has become, I think, much more broad in scope and meaning, but I just think it brings about that a simple concept that exists not just in video games, but all art, and this is what I was trying to get to before, but that's continuity.
Yeah.
Is everything working together to get the main point of your story across. And for Hawking, I guess he felt that in the game, it deals a lot with, I want to say, like, objectivism or free will is going a lot in, because you're this character that doesn't remember, you're the player, the character, you don't quite remember who he is. Who you believe is helping you, turns out the big twist, has been using you the whole time and is the main antagonist of the game and has essentially lied to you. But that is sort of the interesting concept, that themes that BioShock brings up, is what is that sense of free will? So I guess in this gentleman's mind, Hawking, he was saying that twist in the story didn't jive essentially with the gameplay experiences of the first game, of the first BioShock.
Because of the morality plays?
Yeah, I think that's what he was getting at there.
Interesting.
And it essentially just, and now whether or not, like, and he never actually, from the articles I read preparing for this episode, he never actually gave it a really definitive definition.
Yeah.
So for me, I've taken it to just mean simply this, what I said before, when you have that disconnect or the dissonance between the parts of one thing versus the whole of the story. And when it comes to video games, it's specifically referring to the gameplay or the game mechanic and the narrative driving force
now see
of the game. So
I think every game, for the most part, that I can think of has some level of being guilty of.
Oh yeah.
And,
yeah.
And I think we kind of touched on this lightly in the Last of Us episode, and how The Last of Us I think is the first example of something that spun in the other direction to its own benefit. And I think it was kind of like an enlightening point in gaming that, oh, this is how you do it.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, I would agree. Yeah, and just to I'll just define some of the big terms we're going to throw around here, because even I didn't quite know the term ludonarrative. I guess he was just throwing it together, but ludology.
Okay.
Which is the study of games, and it's the act of playing them, the players, the cultures that surround them. Apparently this has become a big thing throughout as games have gotten bigger.
Yeah.
And more ingrained in our culture. I did not realize that. And then the other one is narratology, which is essentially the study of narrative and structure and how stories and all that like affect our human perception and like what it means to be human, universality, stuff like that. And yeah, so for video games, and a lot of people too, if you look at like video game adaptations into movies or shows, if we go back to The Last of Us.
Yeah. So
you still, like, I'm pretty sure you're still firmly saying the game is more of the definitive experience as opposed to
kind of as we
the
discussed.
show.
I do think that that's where like that core story I think lies the best told, not necessarily throwing shade on the show, but I think the story there is given much more time, I think is really the most important part of that, and that in the driver's seat aspect, whereas the show can't compete on that front. But I think that where the show excels is it doesn't try to serve solely as a tangential experience, giving you more borderline outside information on the fringes and outside of the story, and it serves to complement the game rather than try and supplant it.
Yeah. And a lot of people have said like, okay, there's like that. And I think I mentioned this in the Resident Evil episode, how like for the longest time, I always thought, or I was guilty of that, video games aren't real art and they have to, or are not shown as real art, or not, but some people don't believe it to be.
I think you were consistently putting it as like waiting for it to be done justice with a movie adaptation, which
yes, exactly.
is a little
like
bad.
It has to be, like there has to be a movie adaptation to give the Resident Evil games a legitimacy to make them. And I always felt like you needed to have that. And that's where sometimes the so-called ludonarrative dissonance can come in. And then I finally said, you know what? No, because I feel like these are games, not to say that you can't have a better, and there still can be a better adaptation into a movie, but the medium that these are made for is to be a video game.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself is artistic, I believe.
And I think it should be opened up to some additional scrutiny as to what makes a good game, what makes a game a bad game. I think that discussion is just being formed, really. As much as people talk about games online, I feel like the real deep analysis of like what's working, what isn't working is really starting to take shape just fine.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, and that's one of the big things is. So where would you say? Well, first off, I'll say this: I never had heard of this term at all until I was playing. This would be a good example to sort of give you a better idea of all this junk I'm just spewing out of my mouth right now.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the first time that I had really started hearing this thrown around was the debacles with Tomb Raider. Back around the time Last of Us came out there, and the Tomb Raider installment that came out about that time. That was really the first time I think I'd ever even heard it. And even then, back then I just heard it in passing and kind of sloughed it off.
Do you remember what about Tomb Raider was it that like brought it up, or?
I think it was largely like her being depicted as like a young archaeologist, and she's forced in survival mode. The gameplay, then having you kill large number of enemies, just seemed to clash with a lot of what they were putting forward.
Yeah,
with that.
Yeah, no, and that's
her being shown as a vulnerable character didn't seem to jive with her being this total badass, just offing people.
This total badass, yeah.
Like the directions that they went were seemingly opposed to one.
Yeah, the story was going one way. The gameplay goes another. Which, interesting enough, the original Tomb Raider games, she was always a badass. She was more of a sort of a Byronic hero.
Yeah.
Like an anti-hero, because like she didn't really care who she killed. She was a grave robber. She's got tons of money and she's just going in and taking what she wants. Yeah. So I feel like the original games kind of got that right, but also they were limited. But for me, when I first heard it, was Uncharted 4, and it was a similar situation. The story is set around Nathan Drake and his brother, so they kind of go in a little bit more of their history, and he's trying to let go of the adventure life, but not because of that he doesn't love adventure still, but because of all the horrible things that kind of come with it, the killing of people, the trying to survive. So he's the story is trying to tell this narrative of a man who's almost trying to redeem himself, repent for essentially all the lives that he's cost in the years past for his reckless adventure hopping over the world. And as I was playing the game, if you kill so many of the bad guys, you're constantly killing like these unnamed just soldiers. Everyone in the series has someone has a private army or something, and they're looking for something, and those are the guards. If you kill, I want to say it's maybe like 500 or something, you get a reward, a trophy, and it's called
So it's a lot like real life in
Dissonance.
that way.
Yeah. Oh my God. No, Brian. No, this is a family show. But it popped up. I remember having it. It was like toward the end of the game, and then all of a sudden I got this award trophy in-game trophy, Ludonarrative Dissonance, and I was like, what in the hell does that mean?
There's some self-awareness for you.
Yeah, and it just started the trend of me trying to be like, what is this? And I guess they were at Naughty Dog, they were self-aware that they were putting it in there, and they kind of understood this concept that they're trying to tell a story of a man who doesn't want to kill people really anymore, or it feels bad about what he's done. And then yet the gameplay, you got to go and just slaughter everybody you can find. So that was like essentially where the trophy thing came in, and calling it Ludonarrative Dissonance. But that's a prime example. That's a prime example of when you have this disconnect between the gameplay, how the gameplay is run, and then the story that you're trying to tell for it. So where do you stand in terms of, because apparently, like, I didn't know this was a big thing. Maybe it's really not. Maybe I'm just making this up because I went down the rabbit hole too much.
Yeah.
Trying to find stuff out. But so you got ludology and narratology, study of like gameplay, study of the narrative.
Just the general storytelling form.
Yeah. And many people think, or not many people, but there are those who believe that the two are unable to exist together. There always will be that disconnect, especially when it comes to games.
Now, see, that was interesting, because I had this thought when we brought up the two initially here. I was like, it seems like that gap is growing ever smaller as time goes on.
You think?
And I think it's one of those things, I think it'll reach maybe never a total zero, but an insignificant decimal, we'll say.
Yeah. No, yeah, I could see that. It's just essentially, it's like, where do you stand on, like, do you start a game from gameplay, or do you start a game from story? And some people who are more in the story say, like, games should be looked at for their stories like movies or novels, but then people who are more on the gaming side, the ludologists, if you will.
Well, if you reframe that exact same sentence,
it's got to start with the gameplay.
You can reframe that exact same sentence about filmmaking and then have the same argument. Well, it's like, well, do you make a story, make a movie from the script, or do you make it from the camera work and the action? It's like, well, you can do either or. Like, there's not necessarily a yes and no to that.
Yeah, essentially, we have almost like a chicken and egg type scenario, I guess.
Yeah,
going on with this. But yeah, it's strange too when you talk about film, like how many times I can remember this when I'm sure maybe when you had the editing class, oh, this is the final stage of the writing process. And I'd be like, the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, I heard that one a lot, and it's not untrue, but I think it can be a rather backwards way to look at it. Because if your story isn't fairly locked by the time you're getting there, but the argument can be made that things flow and change, and you have to be open to quote unquote rolling with the punches.
Yeah.
And I think is the sentiment there. It's at least as I always took it.
No. Same. It's just interesting to see how doing like the editing, it's still you're essentially rewriting in a way. The film, the story again. Because it's the script is a visual form. So you've got the bare bones, the structure with the script, but now you've got to turn it into a movie.
And there are changes and things that you can make to drastically affect how it will unfold.
Yeah. So if you were, where do you think you would stand when it comes to like video games, this ludonarrative dissonance? Would you say you're more on the gameplay side? Like, is that where, if you were creating one, would you say, I want a game that does this? I'm gonna focus on gameplay first, and then from that, I'll see what story I can craft?
I think it would harshly depend on the game. Honestly, I don't think that there's a definite answer there. I think that the nature of that question opens up how expansive and how
it's almost like there has to be, there's more here that we haven't gotten to, I think, and still discovering. But it's a really broad subject, ludonarrative dissonance. I feel, or like as you get into it, you can look at it in many different ways. Because I even think of it as like, okay, when you're just talking like novels or just writing, do you start something with a character, or do you start something with the plot, or do you kind of do both? Either way works. There's no right or wrong way to do it. I just think with video games, that disconnect, and I think a lot of things have this dissonance in it, no matter what. Even when we did like the Jurassic Park episode, and we were talking like pick out the issues. When you see like those little continuity errors in the production, you can say that that's a little bit of that dissonance, because it brings about that disbelief. It gets rid of that suspension of disbelief when you're watching a movie, and you have that disconnect where, once again, all the parts didn't come together to make a perfect picture, a perfect whole, and which is almost impossible. I feel, though, sometimes I feel like there's always, I don't know if there is one story or movie out there that's could be considered absolutely flawless. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I would agree. I mean, it's just the nature of a performing art. Like, it's just, you're always going to get something wrong. There's always going to be some fine detail. That is, again, it's all up to interpretation. So when one man's trash is another man's treasure. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think that just by the nature of being subjective, that's up to opinion.
Yeah. No, and it's strange with video games too, because I would say my thing would be starting it from the narrative side first, just because that's what I like the most.
Yeah.
Like, I see even some of my favorite video games, I see them as exploring a narrative. Now, but if the gameplay sucks, I'm not going to enjoy it. Like, I know I was going to put the game down. I don't care how good the story is then, but if I can't even like move my character, I know I complain so much about my controller right now. Because I can't. Now that's probably the controller itself, but it's similar to how when we were doing the Exorcist episode, I mentioned how like the sound in that is so good.
Yeah. Well, it's like the
score, like
those technicals, like they are in a film, are a vehicle to get you through the story, and if they're not functioning properly, the story doesn't work. Yeah, the two go hand in hand.
You're quick to. I think I mentioned in that episode, or maybe an earlier one, I think it was Spielberg saying like the audience is quicker to reject a movie with sound issues than they are visual.
Exactly, yeah.
Issue. And it's just, I love this, I really do like this ludonarrative dissonance, and not just for when it comes to video games, but just how it brings up this idea of making a conscious effort to try and have every element have a purpose in your story or your project, and being there, making sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do to affect the greater arc of what you're doing, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does.
Okay, so here's an example, and here's one of my, like, this was another reason.
Yeah.
So we're talking about like a disconnect between video games and the story. And have you ever played the Mass Effect games?
I actually haven't, and they've been on my list for a long time, mostly because you actually, around the time that we first met, you actually were encouraging me to start into those, and I still have yet to get there.
Well, okay. So there's still some of my favorite games of all time, but I'm sure you have. Do you ever remember hearing like the not necessarily controversy, but the outrage or the disappointment over the ending?
I definitely remember hearing, like, because I had a few friends who were fans and were outraged around that time. So I definitely remember that.
Yeah, I was definitely outraged. I was just like, what in the hell did they just do? And I'll try not to give too much away, but one of the things in one of the core concepts of the game is you have this paragon or renegade status. So essentially the game will give you key moments throughout the narrative as you're playing, and you can either do a renegade decision, which is like a more harsher villain thing. So like if there's like a guy who like stole from you, but then you find out, or like he stole from you, you hunt him down, you get him, and the renegade action would be to just shoot him and kill him and take whatever he stole from you back. The paragon action would be to listen to him a little bit or something, and then you find out, oh, I had to steal it because this other guy's got my family or something. And then, so depending on how many decisions you do, like the more renegade decisions you make, the more your villainy, if you will, your infamy goes up. The more paragon decisions you make, the more your heroic stats go up. And then you can do bad. And if you kind of do half here, half there, you kind of stay even Steven, if you will. But essentially the dissonance of that is, regardless of what you choose, the narrative is still going to end up the same way. And you're still going to be seen as a hero, whether it's a ruthless one or an altruistic one. You're still seen as a savior-like figure, because essentially these aliens are coming to wipe out everything in the galaxy, these machines. So yeah, there's that. Once again, there's that dissonance, that disconnect of what the gameplay wants and how the narrative does, and where the narrative goes with it. Because you would think in this world they want to give you that sense of freedom, that free choice. And if you're going back to BioShock again, which I think enhances BioShock's narrative even more, that you didn't really have free choice the whole time. You were being manipulated by the main villain the whole time, but you don't know it until toward the end.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it's like, do you ever really have free choice in games? Even as much as they want to give you, you're still on these prescribed rails, if you will, that the creators
have
set.
May I, even though it isn't a total exception, I would like to throw in Until Dawn into that equation.
Okay. See, I've never played Until Dawn.
Until Dawn kind of unfolds like a choose your own adventure Goosebumps book, in which there's multiple threaded out outcomes that you can wind up at. I forget how many, there's a lot. But based upon the choices that you make, you drastically change the outcome of the game.
Okay. So this one definitely has like more, well, that's almost like the, what is it? Like the Telltale?
Yeah, Telltale Adventures do that to an extent.
Now here's the thing though. Now, would someone argue with that they're more? Those are definitely. Is this a fair argument to say that those are much more narratively driven and designed games?
I would say so. Yeah, they're definitely made with story and plot in mind, I would say.
Yeah. So someone who's more on gameplay, I guess we'd have to get someone, but in terms of gameplay, how interactive is it exactly?
They're on the lower side. You do have interaction, but I would say they did on the lower side. Like Walking Dead and Back to the Future.
They did Back to the Future?
I'm pretty sure that they did Batman for one of them. They've done a few things.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that series has had an interesting run.
Well, yeah, and I know, especially this time of year, there's a lot. They'll come out with like those horror too. I notice a lot of horror games have that point and click. Try to see if your decisions matter.
Yeah.
I don't think of another one I played a while back. Did you ever play Heavy Rain by any chance?
I love Heavy Rain. That game's awesome.
Yeah, that definitely used
scratched a Blade Runner itch for me.
Yeah, it definitely used the narrative. And it tried to integrate the narrative and gameplay more together. It tried to have it so that there wasn't that disconnect between the two.
Yeah.
Trying to think of another one that does it. Portal, which I've never played.
It's good.
But I'm told Portal does it really well, where like it tries not to use cutscenes.
Oh yeah, I don't even think that there are any cutscenes except for the very ending.
Yeah, the more recent one I know that I've played that I can think of is Doom. Well, BioShock does that too.
Yeah.
There's hardly any cutscenes. It's all done through your first perspective, minus the beginning and the end.
Yeah, Doom 2016, I think, is pretty much a straight shot.
Yeah, it's pretty much, and they even like, I've even said like the opening sequence to that, when you wake up and the guys, the doctor, the scientist is trying to curry your favor and talk to you. The Doomslayer just essentially gives him a metaphorical finger and just like throws the computer monitor.
Yeah, it just punches it out
to the floor, destroying it. It's kind of like they're saying like, yeah, this is more about gameplay, but if you want the narrative, there it is too, but you don't need it.
It's a little bit more of a backdrop in that game, but it's there.
But that's Doom, and like, Doom, and we all know why we're playing Doom is to shoot demons and monsters and hack them up with chainsaws.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's just the concept I always found extremely interesting. I still do, but I think it just sort of highlights that tenuous relationship that you have between the parts of a text or narrative or project to its greater whole or meaning. And by that, like, so if we take, I'm trying to think of something else. What movie did you just see? What'd you see?
Five Nights at Freddy's.
Okay, so I guess I have to see it to explain.
Yeah.
I guess I would have to watch it too.
I don't even know the point you're getting at.
No. The point I'm getting at is how. So I'll just use Raiders again.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I always go back to that.
It's never a problem with me. So.
Like, imagine if he didn't have the bullwhip. I know it's hard to imagine that, but take that away.
Blasphemy.
Does the movie become a lot worse? No, but it feels less. Imagine if he didn't have the hat, or if he didn't have his trademark outfit. You take it away. Okay. Again, hard to imagine. Would it still work? Probably would still work, but
not to the same avail.
Is missing. No, yeah. Or if you take it out of the 30s, and put it into a more modern day, would it still work? I don't know. See, that's a big one for me.
I was gonna say, I think it fails immediately for at least Indiana Jones.
Yeah. Well, no, yeah. It's just so interesting. Like, if you were if we were gonna reboot Raiders,
blasphemy.
Do you keep it in the 1930s? I would say, yeah.
I think you have to.
I don't know. Now, maybe I'm too biased from it, and that's why I think some of the newer ones for me don't quite land as well, because it's out of that era that it was taking place in.
Yeah.
That for me. So these are just small little parts, small little details that once you take them away, you can start to see the influence they have on the greater picture, the greater story. And that's just, you're writing a sentence. Words form part of sentences, which form paragraphs form pages eventually form your novel, your book, whatever you're writing. And what words you choose when you're doing like poetry, you got to be really precise on what word you want to use, how you want to say it, whether you want to rhyme here, what's that weird term I'm talking about?
I know it, but I can't find it.
The meter, the iambic pentameter, something along those lines.
Yeah, in there somewhere.
But yeah, I just think it's fascinating how this term in and of itself, this ludonarrative dissonance, is fairly new, especially when it comes to video games. But if you dig deeper to it, it's getting into something that's been around for a while, or is like at the heart of storytelling,
but doesn't necessarily have the linguistics to explain it.
Yeah, that's why it's almost hard to kind of explain it now too. It's because we're touching on something that's very, very forefront. Yeah, not concrete, but the opposite.
Fluid.
There's a word. Help me quickly. Save me from myself.
I don't know.
Not obscure, but it kind of sounds like that.
Abstract.
Abstract. That's it. Abstract.
I did a thing.
Too abstract. We're getting. We're getting on a very, very abstract concept here. I should have led with that. I should have said, let's start over. This is going to be a very abstract thing that we're going to talk about today. Yeah, no, essentially, this even, like, as I was writing, like, the outline for it, I was like, this is kind of a little bit of, like, the first episode, like, Chekhov's gun law that we talked about.
Come full circle.
Planting and payoff. Yes, we've come full circle now, and we're done after this.
No! Fair enough.
So pay up now. But yeah, no, I just thought, like, yeah, ludonarrative dissonance, the term, is new, but what it's touching on is not, I feel, or at least is as old as storytelling.
As old as any multifaceted form of storytelling that isn't a singular writer.
Yeah. But it does from, if we're going back to video games, it does bring up that concept of, okay, can you marry the parts of gameplay and narrative better? can they still be blended better together? Or is there a new sort of structure that needs to be built for video games? Or does it not? Do they just work the way they are? Because like some people have said like video games can't be art because there's an objective. You either get points or something, or I think I remember reading one time in a book that it would be the equivalent of like running like an obstacle course through the Louvre. And every so often you take a break and look at something like the Mona Lisa for a couple seconds, and then you go to the next obstacle, go over the obstacle, then stop, look at a painting or a sculpture, go to the next obstacle, do that. So they said like there's a disruption to the flow of it. I mean, I disagree. I was going to say,
I think I disagree with that as well.
Yeah, I still think they are art. It's just We'll
take a look, for example, too, like at Resident Evil. Resident Evil,
yeah.
You're in that house, you're exploring the whole time, whether things are heightened or not. I think that it still exists as the proverbial painting that you're looking at.
Yeah.
The tension is always there. I don't think that any of the flow is lost there.
I would definitely agree. I mean, that, especially that first one, like you said it perfectly, like that you are in that proverbial painting, and that's your playground if you want.
Yeah. And I think at least specifically in that one, it's like that singular location adds a lot to that. That tension is constant throughout, whether you're in an intense moment or not, because you're always wondering if there will be.
Yeah, exactly. It uses, I definitely, again, biased, but it definitely, the original one, and the original ones too, the second and third, it definitely heavily uses environment. So it's using that particular part to truly help tell, not only enhance the gameplay, but help sort of evoke the emotion and story that they want to create. I think that's why, for me, when they switched to, and I understand they had to because the systems got better, they switched to like that over the shoulder.
Yeah. A lot of games are adopting over the shoulder more and more.
Yeah,
and it's interesting.
That's definitely the thing right now. I'd be interested to see where it goes from here now. But yeah, for me, that using that sort of static security camera style in the classics, that always heightened and whether they knew it or not when they were doing it, that always heightened the terror for me in the gameplay, because you couldn't see some of the times what was, like you said, what's around the next corner. So there's a particular part that I think worked well, not only in gameplay but in narrative form.
Yeah.
As well. Yeah, it's just an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, it's a different one, and like you said, I think it's on the forefront of gaining a lot of the language around it that's going to explain it. There's still a lot of debate about it, because I feel like a lot of people want to get it on the conversation, which is fair, because it's one of those ones you think about it, the concepts are there, they just don't really have.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how
to explain them.
How like some things are still getting defined with that, how the things like we learned we could take a little bit for granted because we didn't have to make it up. It was already, there were people who had done it before us.
Yeah.
But like when film was just getting started, I'm assuming, and I don't think the concept of a dolly move or a track or how to necessarily light it correctly was, you certainly couldn't just look on your phone and get the answer.
Yeah. Well, the argument could be made that that's deadened things. If you have to look something up online, you're getting one person's perspective for it.
True. Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of inventiveness being lost by like the fact that we can just look things up.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer to play an experiment and try and find my own way of doing things a lot of the time. Well, maybe I cross-reference that with something somebody else is doing, but in the end, I make a conscious choice to do what I think is good.
No, yeah, and that brings me to kind of one of my final points was like, so how many times would they say show, don't tell, right?
Absolutely.
Don't tell a story, you got to show it. I've argued that can be a little misleading, as I've tried to get better at writing and storytelling. You always do want to show, but there are some times where you just need to tell something.
I think Sam Mendes movies are a great example of that, because they do both.
Yeah.
Specifically Road to Perdition. And that's partly why I think Road to Perdition is one of my all-time favorites, because it's consistently follows scene to scene, showing you, but it is bookended by this beautiful monologue sequence. And every time you hear somebody say show, don't tell, you're robbing as great storytellers of some of the greatest monologues of all time.
No, yeah, and that's, I think it's just a matter of, you want to show, but telling has its place in there. So if I can break into a math analogy here a little bit, do you remember like X and Y? The graph, the chart, like the X axis, the Y axis. So if like the X axis is how
versus
you
crazy
telling a story. I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't either. I don't know what I never know what I'm talking.
He never knows what he's talking about, man. So the x-axis is like telling a story, right? And like telling a story like is characters having monologues, saying something in a book 1,000 years past.
Yeah.
That's telling. Or the beginning of Star Wars a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Literally written text on the screen. It's real quick. And then of course the scroll where the famous scroll that goes up and literally you got to read it and it catches you up.
Or any of the great horror movies that tell you which day of the week it is and how close we are to being killed.
Yes. Exactly. That is a form of telling. So telling has its place in stories. It's there to just get the information you need, speed things along. It's almost like a connective tissue, a glue
to cut out the
for
fat.
The scenes, the showing. Yes, and then you can show the scenes. Because if you showed everything, my God, how long a story would never end. It would just keep going.
There wouldn't be any cuts. It would be chaos.
You'd probably get bored with it. Which like reminds me of what was the one thing we watched?
Oh, Workmeister Harmonies. You didn't even have to tell me what it was. I already knew what it was. Yeah,
you knew it exactly. Yeah, like that one where it was trying to like to show everything and trying not to cut the way it did. I was not a fan. I respected it for what it was trying to do, but yeah, I was like, yeah, I don't know about this.
Terrible.
But yes, so the x-axis is tell, the y-axis would be show the scenes, how you're going to show it. Don't tell me it's hot out. Describe
how crazy it is out.
Someone. Yeah, describe someone like sweating or how the sun is hitting or whatever you want to do. That's the show and tell of it, the X and the Y. And then if you ever wanted to go into the third dimension, that's the Z. That's where you get the Z axis, right? On this chart.
We're going
and that's
deep.
where I think video games are. No, that's where I think video games are because they break that. They literally break that they break that fourth wall more than any other art form that I can think of. They go into that third dimension because you, as the player, are interacting with the world, with the story, be it whatever it is, even like Tetris.
Yeah.
There's not much of a story there, but you are still interacting. There's that Z-axis that I don't know how to define it really for a video game. It's almost like don't show, don't tell. It's a mix of telling, showing, but then you have
that
to
interaction. It's
that interaction. Yeah. Like how do I let the player tell the story or discover it?
Well,
so that's for me is like
that's like that argument too. We were talking before. It's like cutscenes versus having a scene in the game in which it's actively rendered that you interact, but it's like purely dialogue based. I think that there's cases and situations for both.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting ever flowing thing that I think is getting closer and closer to explainability.
Yeah, and that was for me. That was always like my weird, stupid way of trying to define it for me. I think I had to write a paper too. But yeah, I was using like a math analogy. Like I say, you got the X, you got the Y, and for video games, you get that Z axis, that third dimension now that brings the audience, the reader, the player more into the game, into the world.
It's like Frank Costanza trying to explain the sizes in Seinfeld.
Yes.
You have the A, you have the B, and you have the C.
But yeah, no, it's definitely, it's like I said, a very abstract concept here we've talked about, but I think a very interesting one.
I agree.
And it's more like, I would say it's more about the debate of seeing how those smaller parts can, if they work all together, it can be great, or they can hurt and go different routes. But that could also be what you want too. Maybe you want them to be working against each other. Maybe that creates something that you want to happen in your game or your story. So yeah, definitely something that I think is worth looking into more. Maybe we'll do another one on it.
Yeah, as it develops and gets some more hefty online debate on it, we can chime back in and take it. I
highly recommend looking into it more if you're interested in weird concepts like this, like I am. I weep for you as well, as I do myself every day.
Down the literal rabbit hole of this one, because
it's just interesting how the term is new, but what it's the definition of it or what it's bringing about
is a tale as old as time.
I knew you were going to say it. God damn it! I was literally in my back of my mind. I'm like, don't say it, Brian. Don't say it. And you did.
Yeah, and then copyright strike.
Yes, this whole episode copyright strike.
The whole thing.
Copyright stricken. Talk about some dissonance that we got dissed hard.
Ooh.